Want to know how to live skeptically and still have friends? So do I. Let's figure it out. Actually Speaking, a podcast that explores the human side of skepticism, critical thinking, and the skills we need to make it through the day. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of Actually Speaking, a podcast that sets the science aside and explores the human side of skepticism. My name is Meraz, and today we'll be exploring the topic of critical thinking. We're only a few episodes into the podcast, but we've covered some fairly significant ground. Most of what we've tackled has been aimed at creating a foundation for future efforts, concentrating our efforts on things that present the most significant barriers to healthy relationships, communication, and the promotion of critical thinking. In other words, we've been focusing on the barriers we bring with us. Just like critical thinking, as we'll see, focusing on ourselves and our own barriers and limitations is essential to move forward. We started off by looking at our own expectations and making sure they were realistic and achievable and within our control. We distilled those expectations down into simple goals to guide our interactions with others when promoting healthy skepticism, a sense of curiosity and caution, the basic building blocks of skepticism. We learned to identify and minimize affective filters, which represent significant emotional barriers to learning. And finally, we examined the benefits of attaching new knowledge to existing knowledge when promoting skeptical concepts. Now, we haven't done all this in an effort to simply be less confrontational. That's certainly a benefit, but the goal has always been to be more effective in promoting skepticism and critical thinking. In doing all this, we've laid the foundation for casual but effective learning to occur in our social interactions with family and friends. The knowledge we often want to share is fairly effective on its own, but what we've done has been to clear the path and remove as many obstacles as possible. We're learning to adapt our style of communication to a non- or less skeptical audience, and in doing so, we're creating an environment in which critical thinking is much more likely to occur. Now, almost every skeptical or science podcast I've seen has done an episode on critical thinking at some point. The details on critical thinking and all the associated logical fallacies can easily take up several episodes to explore fully. And I've yet to find a podcast that hasn't done an excellent job of this. Skim through the episodes of your favorite skeptic or science podcast, or do a Google search and you'll easily find all the information you need on critical thinking. However, that's not what we're going to do here. We'll go into some of the basics in order to have a general understanding of what critical thinking is and its various components. But we'll focus more on a more realistic implementation and the significant resistance it often encounters. Let's start with something a little bit different. Sometimes I prefer a bit of fiction with my facts. A little fantasy to help us view and explore certain issues in a way that frees us from the typical limitations of reality and gives us a greater perspective. Plus, it's just a fun way to gain insight. For me, if I were to imagine the ultimate fictional encounter between a skeptic and non-skeptic, it would certainly be an encounter between a representative of an advanced alien culture and a human. How amazing would that be? There certainly could be no greater example of scientific fact and technology thoroughly obliterating any remaining mysticism left in humanity. But what would that encounter look like? What would be learned? And how would humanity change? Fortunately, I can defer to the imagination of someone far more knowledgeable on the matter than myself, Carl Sagan. His novel, Contact, and I'll issue spoiler warnings here, explores this very issue in his fictional tale of humanity's first encounter with alien intelligence. The story follows the collaborative efforts of the world in creating an alien machine which allows a single human to make contact with a single alien. As a scientist, Sagan had an opportunity to provide us with a fictional tale of science, technology, and skepticism winning out over the mysticism that still holds over our world. Clearly, Sagan is a man that understands the value and importance of critical thinking to the well-being of any civilization. So it was almost a certainty that the promotion of skepticism and critical thinking would show itself in this first encounter between human and alien. Well, it did, but not in the way most expected. The encounter that Sagan describes at the end of his book when Ellie, the human representative, finally meets the aliens is far from scientific. It's human. And if you read it carefully, you get a glimpse of how Sagan envisions and imagined the ideal communication of skepticism and critical thinking. His message at the end shows that our science and technology are not all that's important about us. Our human nature and the manner in which we interact, galactic contact serving as a metaphor for interpersonal contact, is important as well. The aliens could have been portrayed as advanced overlords whose contact was needed to set straight the backward thinking of humanity. But that wasn't the image Sagan wanted to portray for such an advanced and intelligent beings. The aliens are compassionate, kind, and considerate. They do not make Ellie feel stupid or insignificant. In fact, they remind Ellie that science and technology aren't the only things of value in a civilization, nor the only things to learn from each other. As the encounter unfolds, we see in Ellie a very natural human bias of thinking in black and white. It's a simpler way of thinking, more comfortable, and unfortunately very common. In comparison, the alien thinks in more complex shades of gray, allowing for and tolerating greater degrees of ambiguity. Aggressiveness, we learn, is self-defeating, and failure is presented as something to be protected within a civilization because it promotes the ability to learn. We also see the alien asking questions of Ellie for which the answers are already known. Why? Well, it's done for Ellie's sake and not their own. Talking, listening, and valuing the contributions and involvement of others are important. Even with a cursory look at Sagan's fictional encounter, we begin to see the elements of effective, non-threatening, and inclusive communication. The respect, acceptance, and tolerance of the many biases and failings that are simply part of our human condition. What we don't see are the aliens forcing their science or technology upon Ellie. In fact, criticism of humanity is provided very honestly, but only after being asked. And the aliens freely share that there are things which they don't know and are currently beyond their reach. While advanced, they portray themselves as undergoing the same learning process as humans. Myths and religion have been replaced by a realistic understanding of what they know and don't know, and patience that answers will come is clearly shown. We're shown that no matter how smart we become, we will always have more to learn. There is no finish line, just a journey. In the end, the encounter served the purpose of building a relationship, removing barriers, fueling curiosity with calls for caution. And then Ellie returns home, and humanity is left to its own devices to proceed. Now, I'm happy to take any opportunity to talk about Sagan and any of his writing, but I'm bringing up this particular book and encounter because it encapsulates better than anything I've ever read the ideal elements for the promotion of skepticism and critical thinking. The character of Ellie in Sagan's book could be anyone in our daily lives, including ourselves. And that is important because in this fictional lesson, Sagan places us in the position of the non-skeptic, the mystic, and the believer, in a relative sense. We are allowed to see how it would feel to be confronted by someone of significant intelligence, experience, and power. What we find is someone who sets aside the level of knowledge attained and treats us as equals on a journey of learning, recognizes our biases and limitations, and values them for the motivation and lessons they provide us, sees that science and technology aren't the only thing of value, nor the only influence on our decision-making. We're left to feel not so alone in our effort to understand a complicated world. We're left with the freedom and responsibility for our own learning, but with a great example and model from which we can learn. So, what is critical thinking? Well, briefly for our purposes, what we need to understand is that critical thinking is a process of evaluating information in a way that takes into account the limitations of our own thought process. In other words, as human beings, we have natural biases in the way we think. Religion, ideologies, expedience, peer pressure, cultural norms, upbringing, etc., which prevent us from evaluating information comprehensively and objectively. These limitations, or biases, are often collectively referred to as logical fallacies. Critical thinking is an ongoing effort to remove or minimize these biases when evaluating information. Critical thinkers are those who are curious and cautious with a motivation to keep themselves informed about topics in order to make the best decisions. It also involves the ability to withhold judgment until we have an opportunity to evaluate information. In order to think critically, we need to focus on the quality of our thinking and not just the quantity. The more we can remove biases from our thinking, the greater the likelihood that our decisions will be based on knowledge and evidence. So why is there so much resistance to critical thinking? Thinking critically is a bit like thinking skeptically, in that everyone really has an intuitive understanding and basic level of skill. It's certainly muddied by our emotions and biases, but it's there. We often differ only in the degree to which we apply these skills in our lives. We have different thresholds or triggers for when we choose to allow them to kick in. Now, we see this all the time. We have religious friends who believe firmly in Scripture in one instance, but reject it in another. Some are loyal alternative medicine advocates right up until a more serious illness presents itself. Others consult psychics with the most mundane decisions, yet fail to use them when it comes to car trouble or finding the best dentist. Take a look at your family and friends, and you'll see these boundaries, which are often simply based on personal values. Yes, some people are really lost causes, but most are not quite as non-skeptical as they'd have us believe. The truth is, there are many reasons, and some very complex, for why people fail to think critically in more situations and more often. The research on this topic is best left for another time and probably a different podcast. What's been most helpful for me is a simpler and more practical understanding for this discrepancy. These are the things that I keep in mind in my daily interactions with others. I can distill them down into 3 areas. The first is what I call the conservation of skeptical energy. Let's face it, living skeptically and applying the strategies of critical thinking takes time and energy. It's hard work sorting through our own information sources, investigating their validity, analyzing our own biases, exploring differing opinions in order to formulate positions or make decisions. Most of us are more concerned with finding a few extra minutes in our busy days to simply not think, sleep a little longer, or catch up with a friend. It's just not a priority for most people. Many that I know personally are fully aware that they might be falling for a scam, buying a bad product, or believing in something that they would drop instantly when push came to shove. But they do it anyway, because the risk versus reward isn't compelling enough. We all fall in different places on the skeptical, critical thinking spectrum, and this is simply another example of that choice. We all have different triggers as to when our skeptical natures will kick in. Those of you listening have very short triggers, but most others have much larger buffer zones. The second is what I call the power of familiarity. Simply put, we are drawn to people, behaviors, or situations with which we are familiar, whether or not those things are constructive. You don't need a background in counseling to see this habit. We see it in innocent things, like a person who leaves one bad relationship only enter into another bad relationship, or in a more serious situation where a person who leaves an abusive relationship will often connect with another abusive partner. And reality television, to give a trivial example, offers us an abundant supply of people who are locked into certain styles of decorating, fashion, work, relationships, and such, and are unable or unwilling to deviate without the help of an enthusiastic host. We seek comfort in things that are familiar to us, so much that it impacts our choices and decisions both in trivial and harmful ways. A lack of critical thought allows us to remain in areas of familiarity and comfort, and some people want that. The third is the protection of beliefs, and this is where a lot of resistance comes into play. Many people hold on to their beliefs and defend them regardless of knowledge and evidence to the contrary. True critical thinking requires an ability to change beliefs and positions based on new information and evidence. Very often, people are fully capable of thinking critically and actually display this ability in many situations, but choose not to in order to protect their beliefs and positions. Look, as self-proclaimed skeptics, we're not perfect either. We simply place a higher value on critical thought and therefore incorporate it more fully into our lives. But make no mistake, we are fully capable of conserving our own skeptical energy, taking comfort in familiar and non-skeptical behaviors, and protecting beliefs we value. These are all very normal human behaviors. Ask yourself, do you have any guilty pleasures? Of course you do. And by definition, these are things that if we put thought into, we could find countless reasons why we shouldn't have them. But we do, and we do so willingly. Because there's a part of us that realizes that not everything needs to be looked at critically. Much does. I don't mean to minimize its importance, but not everything. When we step back, we see that we're on the same journey and face the same challenges as everyone else. Our values simply differ, and we therefore apply and prioritize skepticism and critical thought in different ways and to different degrees within our daily lives. So, how do we promote critical thinking? Well, based on the 3 limitations I shared for the resistance I see towards critical thinking, I do have some practical strategies that I've chosen to implement in my daily life. Now, I'm happy that I do have relationships where the topic of critical thinking can be discussed and promoted in far more detail than presented here. But remember, these strategies represent starting points and are for the non or less skeptical individuals in my social circles. Number 1. Show people shortcuts to critical thinking. Share good resources for information which acknowledge the limited time they have available. This is where being a trusted resource for factual information comes in handy. And as long as there is no immediate harm present, allow people wiggle room to prioritize their own critical thinking energies. While a more vigorous run provides much better exercise, I'm often content to see people simply walking around the block rather than getting no exercise at all. The same applies to critical thinking, at least from my perspective. 2. Be the best example you can be of critical thinking. Demonstrate critical thinking in your own decision-making process in order to allow others to slowly become familiar with what that process looks like and the benefits it presents. I cannot stress this enough. Show, don't tell. Be the best critical thinker you can possibly be and demonstrate the benefits. 3. Demonstrate your ability to change your beliefs or positions based on new information. Don't be shy about this. Share your choices and your beliefs and the reasons why. Don't impose them. Let others see how your beliefs stem from your objective evaluation of information, rather than your beliefs defining facts and your reality. Number 4, identify areas where a person is already demonstrating critical thought and compliment them on that skill. Articulate the components and strategies you see them using in order to help them become familiar with the terms, strategies, and concepts. Take it out of their intuitive realm and help them see the structure and the process, and then encourage them to apply those skills in other areas. There are some things in life that people simply need to learn to do on their own. No amount of detail, explanation, or teaching can achieve a skill which is basically learned by doing. No matter how well you describe the mechanics of riding a bike, swimming, skating, or whistling, the only way to learn is by doing. And in these instances, the best way to motivate someone is by being an example, modeling, and demonstrating the benefits and advantages. Want to spread the desire to think critically among your family and friends? Then be the best critical thinker you can possibly be, and share the benefits the process provides you. Once people want to know more, there will be plenty of time and details to cover. But until then, show off those cool, shiny critical thinking skills. Flaunt the freedom and independence it provides you. You just might pique the interest of those who've yet to learn and motivate them to give it a try. Thank you all for the feedback and the topic suggestions that you've submitted. Each one has been added to my growing list of episode ideas, and there's always room for more, so please feel free to submit them. And if you have a moment, a quick review on iTunes to help spread the word about the podcast is always appreciated. In the next episode, we're going to shift gears a little bit and set skill building aside. Instead, we're going to explore the topic of gender and race by looking at the concept of human nature. If you have questions, comments, or would like to share your own tips and ideas on living skeptically, send them to actuallyspeaking@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/factually. Thanks for listening.